Alright, I know I said I would try to do a more positive video, and that's coming, but I felt that just like my video on cetacean bans that this had to be made. And after doing some research on YouTube, I've realized only 2 other people have made videos on this subject, and well, it wasn't done in a way that really matters. This is really surprising because this has been a topic of discussion in the dolphin community for the past 2 years. So today I'm going to talk about the SWIMS Act and what it means for the animals it protects. So what is the SWIMS Act and what does it do? Well, SWIMS is an acronym. It stands for Strengthening Welfare in Marine Settings. When I was first introduced to the bill, I thought it had something to do with protecting the critically endangered wild populations of the United States, like the southern resident killer whales in Washington or the Atlantic right whales. Maybe it would increase fines for companies that pollute our ocean, or fishing trawlers that bycatch dolphins and seals. Possibly there was an increase of distance swimmers and boaters would have to keep between themselves and animals in the water. Well, what if I told you it did none of that? Alright, so what does the SWIMS Act do? The SWIMS Act is actually an amendment to the Marine Mammal Protection and the Animal Welfare Acts. The MMPA was implemented in 1972 in partial response to growing concerns among scientists and the general public that certain species of populations of marine mammals were in danger of extinction or depletion as a result of human activities. Anyway, the amendment, what does it do? Well, let's first look at the findings, aka why they're bringing this bill forward. In the first paragraph, they state that the listed species in effect, orcas, belugas, false killer whales, and pilot whales, are too smart to be kept in captivity. And I won't deny that. These animals are extremely intelligent. They're on a list of species we've learned so much about from doing studies on our captive population. This includes chimpanzees and octopus as well. The next paragraph goes on to say that the animals die prematurely, exhibit zoochosis, have lacking environments, and are sometimes isolated from other members of their species. And this is unfortunately true. If you look at the history of these species in captivity, there's a long list of animals that have died prematurely. Sure, there are some outliers that have shattered expectations, but the reality is these animals do not last long in captivity, and it's a miracle if they even meet the average life expectancy for their species. After this, the bill states, laws allow the species listed to be confined in concrete tanks that fail to meet their basic psychological, physical, and social needs, and it is the sense of Congress that the species listed in paragraph 1 of subsection A should not be subject to restraint, coercion, or control by any person for purposes of public display. So let's do some critical thinking for a moment. The bill states that 4 specific species are too smart for captivity and suffer because of it. They die prematurely and live in environments that fail to meet their basic needs. And they think that the animals shouldn't be subjected to public display. Looking at these 3 statements, we can only concur that the bill, the SWIMS Act, is aimed to get animals like these removed from their current tanks and moved to yet-to-be-built sanctuaries, something that with government funding could possibly happen in the next decade. Nope! Gotcha again! The SWIMS Act is an amendment to the MMPA that bans the import, export, breeding, and capture of orcas, belugas, false killer whales, and pilot whales. They can only be exported to go to a sanctuary or to be released into the wild. The sanctuary must keep them in a natural setting, not breed the animals or put them on public display. Captures and imports can happen as long as it is not for the purposes of public display. I feel like I'm the only person who can look at this bill and laugh, because it is exactly like the bills that they passed in France and Canada, and if you watched my last video, you'd know how well those worked out. So let's look at the facts and see how urgent it is that we pass this bill and how effective it would be. Until today, you probably didn't know that the United States even housed false killer whales. They aren't exactly a common species. Like the bill suggests, they don't do well in captivity, and that's why we only have hybrids now. If you were on the internet in the 2010s, you probably would have heard of the mutant hybrid Dolphin. Well, that's actually Kikemalu from Sea Life Park, Hawaii. And in 2005, she gave birth to her daughter, a back cross, which means the calf is only a quarter pseudo-orca. The last full-blooded false killer whale actually died in 2019 at Sea Life Park, Oahu.
Kina came to the park in 2015 with longtime companions. She participated in research on the effects of sonar on marine mammal hearing.
The bill doesn't state if it even covers hybrids, but even if Sea Life bred them again, the percentage of pseudo-orca would only get smaller. Alright, I have no clue how to transition this, so this is just going to be a weird jump. For each species, I decided to actually go back and see when and who was the last individual to experience one of the 4 events the bill states. I got the majority of this info from Cetas, which is somewhat outdated, so this info is probably not completely accurate, but I'm working with what I've got. As far as I'm aware, there has never been an export of pseudo-orca, so that's easy to cross off. Now, this next part is going to sound crazy for some of the older folks listening. The last individual imported was Mulahia to Sea Life Park, Hawaii, and that was in 1990. You're probably thinking, oh, that wasn't too long ago. No, that was 34 years ago. What? I feel so old. Continuing on, the last birth was Jozu at SeaWorld in 1994, and the last capture was Ahanalu by Sea Life Park in 1976. I would like to add a note that the majority of the imported false killer whales were actually from the infamous Taiji drive hunts. If you'd like to learn more, I'd suggest reading about it on Dolphin Project's website. The link will be in the description. Considering the last capture happened 48 years ago, false killer whales aren't exactly a high priority target for this bill. Like I said, we only have hybrids now. Well, what about the next species on the list? Pilot whales, just like pseudo-orca, don't do well in captivity. From what I can recall, it's rare for a captive-born calf to survive past a year. It's really sad, and it's echoed by our records. The last calf born was never named, and was born at SeaWorld back in 1964. It's been theorized that the mother was already pregnant before she was captured, so it wasn't even a captive-bred calf. The last captured individual was 9 Lives by SeaWorld in 1982, and the last export was Hubber from SeaWorld to Marineland, Canada in 1973. Now what about import? Well, arguably, this would have been a situation that would bypass the SWIMS Act.
The pilot whale's name is Sully, and his story began in July of 2009 when he stranded on a Curacao beach.
Well, it was a skeleton. I mean, it was as emaciated as a whale or dolphin could possibly be and still be swimming.
Sully was a pilot whale that stranded in Curacao in 2009. After an extensive rehabilitation process, they tried to get him to integrate back into the wild by introducing Sully to wild pods. Unfortunately, instead of joining his kind back in the wild, he decided to stay with the humans that had cared for him. This led to a problem. The local aquarium wasn't designed to house an animal Sully's size. The decision was made to send Sully to SeaWorld San Diego in 2010 to join their 2 other pilot whales. This move wasn't made to put Sully on display, but was to improve his welfare so he could be in a larger environment and be with his own species while in human care. Honestly, I feel like loopholes such as bringing in animals to improve its welfare, or, like we saw in Canada, exporting an animal for research purposes really diminishes the effect of the SWIMS Act or any other bans that specifically state that imports and exports can't be done for the sole purpose of public display. But what about strandings? Would rescue work be affected? These are the questions that aren't being asked when it comes to the SWIMS Act. Speaking of rescue work, let's move on to the beluga population. Belugas have a long history in captivity stretching all the way back to the 1800s. Even P.T. Barnum had belugas in his circus. So what about now? Well, the majority of belugas were imported from Canada, but the last one caught in US waters was in 1967 by the Vancouver Aquarium. Canada is also where the last imports came from. Like I stated in my last video, 5 belugas were imported in 2021 for research purposes, despite Canada's ban on exporting the animals. The last birth was Tulloch at SeaWorld the same year. And as far as I know, belugas haven't been exported from the United States. It's starting to sound like the bill is mostly for belugas, but we haven't gotten to the stars yet. Let's talk about orcas, the poster child of the SWIMS Act. Look at all the marketing for this bill. The majority of these include pictures of orcas. Even the logo for the bill has an orca on it. Speaking of the marketing of this bill, I would like to take you down a rabbit hole of the misleading images used by articles talking about this bill. I usually give run-of-the-mill news organizations a pass because they usually just Google images and pick whatever they think looks best, but when it comes to animal rights groups, that's when I usually bring the hammer down. Take this article by Animal Welfare Institute. Now, where do you think this photo was taken? Mystic Aquarium, Georgia Aquarium, SeaWorld? Nope. This photo was taken at Kanagawa Sea Paradise in Japan. Okay, well what about these photos I used earlier? Well, this is Kiska at Marineland, Canada, and this is Keiko, the star of Free Willy. And while this photo was taken while he was in the United States, he was only here as part of the rehabilitation process.
Looking beyond the delightful dance between Keiko and his fans, Keiko's new playground has a serious purpose. Keiko has health problems. For starters, he's too skinny. But his appetite is already improving. He's already eating more than in Mexico City, and his trainers hope to double his intake by next week. It's impossible to tell Keiko's admirers not to get attached, but remember, he's here only to gain the strength he needs to leave captivity.
This article by Focusing on Wildlife? This is the most recognizable orca in captivity. Look at that birthmark. Well, who is she? This is Lynn, and this is at the Port of Nagoya Aquarium in Japan. I mean, come on! And this is just AI-generated content. I could probably do a whole nother video on this topic alone, but we need to get back on track. Orcas. They're the literal poster child of the bill. So like belugas, they must have had a ton of recent activity, right? As of 2023, there's only one park chain that houses orcas, SeaWorld. Over its 3 parks, they house 18 killer whales. Their last, and I mean their last birth, was in 2017.
Sad news from SeaWorld this morning. An orca, born just 3 months ago in San Antonio, has died. She was the last calf to be born in captivity as part of the SeaWorld breeding program.
And that's because they've already pledged to stop breeding.
Happening now. This will be the last generation of orcas at SeaWorld. The company who helped the world fall in love with orcas will end all orca breeding and transition away from theatrical orca shows. The animals will continue to live at SeaWorld under world-class care where visitors can see them for years to come.
And this is because of California's own ban on orca breeding that passed in 2016.
Today, Los Angeles Congressman Adam Schiff announced he would introduce legislation in Washington, D.C. to prohibit SeaWorld from breeding orcas. It echoes a ruling the California Coastal Commission made last month.
Takara was already pregnant, so her daughter Kiara was the last orca to be born in their parks. SeaWorld also had a hand in the last captured orca in U.S. waters, Canuck, in 1972. And they also did the last export of orcas, which was when they sent 4 of their whales to Loro Parque, Spain in 2006. The import of orcas hasn't happened since 2002, when Six Flags brought Shuka over from France. But what if I told you that that wasn't the only import that could have happened that year? Now you might think that SeaWorld might have been up to something, but no. This time it was the Miami Seaquarium, home to the world's smallest orca tank. You're probably wondering the same thing I am. Where the hell would they fit a second whale? This isn't the 70s. You can't get away with having 2 adult orcas in a tank that small anymore. Well, that answer was never given because thankfully the permit was denied. But who was the permit for? Who was Miami Seaquarium trying to bring to their pitiful excuse of an orca tank? Well, it was none other than Keiko. See, Keiko had been released from a sea pen in August of 2002, and he was already pictured approaching humans and generally not grouping up with other members of his kind. He was alone and seeking human touch. And while this was concerning, sending him to Miami Seaquarium was far from the solution. And honestly, it is laughable that they would not only have the gall to apply for a capture permit, but write Norway's Ministry of Fisheries. The audacity. Now that we know more about the recent history of these animals, we can now see that this bill, like others passed before it, is going to change almost nothing. Honestly, it feels like the bill is missing something that other legislation has had before. Why aren't dolphins on the bill? Maybe they decided that going after whales in captivity would be easier, and I would agree. It's like closing a box with only 2 things in it, as opposed to closing a box that's overflowing. And I mean overflowing. Let me try to visualize this for you guys. Again, I get most of my info from the Cetas base, which is a little outdated, so this information isn't 100% accurate. As far as I'm aware, the United States has 30 separate facilities, along with the Navy's private population of dolphins. To those who don't know, the Navy uses dolphins as working animals, along with sea lions.
Dolphins in particular have become the watchdog for the US Navy over the last few decades. Today, Navy dolphins are primarily trained in one important task: to locate underwater objects.
Across all 31 of these facilities, there are 10 different species, which include 2 hybrid species. Half of these are really small numbers, we're talking 3 to a single individual, so I lumped them together in the Other Species tab. By the way, PSWD stands for Pacific White-Sided Dolphin. It was just too long to put on there, so that's why it's abbreviated. I only separated the false killer whale hybrids and the pilot whales from the others for the slide that represents the percentage of these animals affected by the SWIMS Act. That is, until I bring in the bottlenose population. The United States has 402 bottlenose dolphins, 26% of which are owned by SeaWorld, and directly behind them is the Navy at 18%. And that's why I think the ban didn't go after the most common cetacean in our country. Not only do we have a monstrous population, but a good chunk of them is owned by the military. But that's just a theory. So in reality, the SWIMS Act only affects 11% of the United States cetacean population. But if you put into account that the only pilot whales we have are rescues and a female, the only false killer whales we have are hybrids and are a mother and daughter pair, and that SeaWorld is not breeding their orcas to the point where they've separated their males and females, as well as putting their females on birth control. This bill really only affects the breeding of beluga whales. So only 6% of the captive population is going to be affected by this bill. Needless to say, I feel like that proves that the SWIMS Act is a waste of Congress's time. It's like putting a band-aid on a scab while ignoring an open wound. And just like the bill states, it only prevents the import, export, capture, and breeding of these animals. They'll still be in captivity until the day they die. Alright, I have no idea how to end this video, so let's go through a few things. Number 1, if you heard a train or some rumbling at any point during the recording, I am so sorry. I've been battling with trains for the past 2 days of trying to record this, and it honestly feels like they only show up when I hit the record button. It's a nightmare. Second thing, I'm still so astounded with the numbers crunch. Like, not only that we have over 400 dolphins in the United States, but that at the end of the day, this bill really only affects like less than 10%? Like, this is insane. I honestly feel like one of the Congress members' kids was like, hey, I watched Blackfish and we should end captivity. No, I'm not going to look at any of the records that we have. I'm just going to go with my feelings. And that could be another video, really, about how most activism is done by feeling alone and not by looking at the facts. And it's just, man, if you came here from the Halo community and you're still here by the end of this video, my dude, the rabbit hole goes deep. If you want me to keep covering the more niche topics in the dolphin community, go ahead and leave a like or comment about it, because it gets weird, man. It gets weird and it gets sad. But anyway, I'll try and figure out what to do for my next video. I pinky swear it will be less depressing. And yeah, we'll just see where we go from there. So, I'll see you guys later. Swim safe.